There's some critical debate about the significance of the opening scene. It ranges from some critics who believe that it's largely pointless to others who think that it is extremely important. Cunningham thought that the scene was so bad that Shakespeare couldn't have written it. He thought it seemed of spurious authorship and it lacked any dramatic point whatsoever. Granville Barker said much the same thing. He thought the opening was un-Shakespearean. The scene is a poor scene and a pointless scene. But Coleridge, on the other hand, said that the true reason for the first appearance of the Weird Sisters is to strike the keynote of the whole play. Strike the keynote of the whole play. And Coleridge argued that in Shakespeare, generally, what you see in the opening scenes in most of the plays is the sowing of germs, the full development of which appears at a future time. Germs there in the old-fashioned sense of seeds, like to germinate. Although there's the sense in which in Macbeth, it's both germs in that sense, but also a kind of disease that infects everything, the filthy air. So it's not altogether wrong-headed to think of it in terms of germs as in infection as well. L.C. Knight, a modern critic, said that the theme of the whole play is stated in the first act, and the first scene is so important that every word of it bears the closest scrutiny and strikes one dominant chord. Now, you don't have to agree entirely with any of those critical ideas about it, but you should think for yourself about why you think the first scene is important or otherwise. Macbeth is the only Shakespeare play that begins with supernatural characters on stage alone. This means it's difficult to explain them away as being merely the hallucinations or visions of one of the human characters on stage. So that perhaps is one of the important points about it. One way in which it strikes the keynote of the play as involving the supernatural, which is an objective presence. It's interesting that although the witches are always called witches in the stage directions, so that's what Shakespeare calls them, only the sailor's wife in the actual play ever actually calls them that. Instead, they're called instruments of darkness, juggling fiends, but most often, wayward sisters. That's the original in the folio text. It's often changed to weird instead, toning it down slightly. But wayward has implications of being wrong-headed, willful, perverse, or ungoverned. It's a slightly darker term than witches is. So just note there's a slight difference between what they're called in the stage directions versus what the characters in the play actually call them. Banquo, first of all, mentions that they're instruments of darkness, linking them to the devil. Because there are three of them, you might also be thinking of them in terms of the Fates from Greek mythology, who spin the thread of each man's life and cut it as well. The Fates or Furies. Our first impressions of them are largely confused. We're not sure what they've been doing before the play begins. We don't know what, if any, is their relation to the battle. We're not sure if they've raised the storm that they are speaking in, and also mention they will meet Macbeth in later. And everything they do and say seems to be very much focused on the future. Most of Shakespeare's tragedies have some sort of reference to events that took place before the play, but Macbeth stands out as not doing that. It's very much a future-orientated play. The Witches' focus on the future is probably related to their main function of prophecy. So our first impression then is largely confusion, disorder, and mystery. The first word, when shall we three meet again, refers to the future. It's not if they're going to meet, it's when they're going to meet, and the future's going to repeat the past as well, when and again. When thinking about the times they might meet, you can see that they apply the structure of time as a whole to the future. So it might be during a storm, thinking about the present, but in reference to the future. It could be after a battle that is yet to take place, or it could be before the sun sets. So in either case, everything they think about, whether it's during something, after something, or before something, the future is central to how they're envisioning their next meeting. Remember, this is because the witches, especially at the beginning of the play, are related to the idea of prophecy very strongly. The rhyme between when and again is thematically important. So the witches see what is to take place in the future as largely a recurrence of the past. This is a play, remember, in which nothing is done when 'tis done. So the fact that when is rhymed by again, and therefore echoing when, is then rhymed again by rain, reinforces this sense of the future echoing the past, deeds resounding. The second witch echoes the first by using when twice in her reply. So there's an insistence on this idea. The repetition of the words points towards a thematic significance. And no matter how characters might try to avoid this later on, it's still there. I'm afraid to think what I have done. Look on it again, I dare not. But the thoughts don't go away, and the blood as well is a visual reminder and a way of forcing the characters to look on their guilt and to remember, despite their wishes not to. If you think about the theme of confusion as well, which is important because being a tragedy, the play largely tends towards disorder, political confusion, social, the breakdown of the marriage, also on an individual level, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's minds tending towards confusion and disorder too. A few phrases stand out. In thunder, lightning, or in rain separates three things that are normally joined together. A storm is likely to involve all three, but they seem to be suggesting that it might be thunder they meet in, or it might be lightning, or it might be rain, separating what we normally join together. And yet they also talk about it being a time when the battle's lost and won, combining what we usually distinguish, losing or winning. Is it lost by one person and won by another? Or is this right at the beginning letting us know that the same person, Macbeth, will win in one sense but lose in another? His victory will become his defeat. Might be hinting at how his lust for power and ambition will ultimately be his downfall. In that case, it's a kind of Pyrrhic victory, a victory at too great a cost. The very hubris that drives him on the battlefield. And remember, Shakespeare emphasises this by making him defeat both the rebels in hand-to-hand, face-to-face, man-to-man combat, whereas in Holinshed, the source material, one runs away, the other kills himself. The very hubris that seems to drive him on the battlefield, doubly redoubling strokes upon the foe, memorising another Golgotha, also is his undoing. Perhaps the most important word in the opening scene is done. And if you think about how this echoes in the subsequent scenes, I find it laughable that there are some critics who thought the opening scene was pointless. I think Coleridge is much closer to the truth by saying that it strikes the keynote of the whole play. Quick word count across the whole play reveals that done and undone occur 38 times. Done, do, did, 158, deed, 17. Even in the names of important characters and places, this word is echoed. Duncan, Dunsinane. And then, perhaps most interestingly, very unusually, dunnest is used only once in the whole of Shakespeare. It's called a hapax legomenon. It's when a word occurs just once across a body of text. And normally when this happens in Shakespeare, it's really a sign that something important is going on. It's like in Othello, for example, when he demands the ocular proof of Desdemona's infidelity. He wants Iago to get him the handkerchief. show me the ocular proof. Ocular is used just once, and it's arguably the most important word in the whole play thematically. So Lady Macbeth is echoing the atmosphere introduced by the witches at the beginning of the play. So structure is about patterns across the whole work, and sometimes those patterns can be created by the repetition of words. So textual echo is one way to think about context in the play. If you spot any words, especially if you are answering on an extract question, if you spot any words that you know are repeated significantly, then it's worthwhile making some links outside the extract and thinking about what it adds to your understanding of this moment. We're not done with done. There are more points to make about it. The fact that it rhymes with the unstable one. When the battle's lost and won, there was an instability there. Was it one person wins, one person loses? Was it one person both wins and loses? It's ambiguous. The fact that done rhymes with one, therefore, gains something of that instability. Because on one level, what Macbeth does is never done. If it were done when 'tis done.
Where's that?
I.e., if it were done with when it was done, Act 1, Scene 7, thinking about killing Duncan, who's the one who gets done. But on the other hand, it's also completely done. Lady Macbeth, what's done cannot be undone. So he's dead, he can't go back. You've done Duncan. And yet, it's not done, because it continues. You can't shut the deed up. The guilt continues to plague him. The fear of being found out is still there. So there's this strange paradox of it being both irreversible but incomplete, which is one of the tensions in the play, and one of the tensions in Macbeth individually, and between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth as a couple. The drama is about tension and conflict, and we can see that even reflected in the texture of the language and some of the words that Shakespeare is playing on. So we want to think about some of the words in this opening scene as echoing in subsequent scenes. There's an amazing bit right at the end when Macbeth faces Macduff, and he talks about sheathing his sword undeeded, to sheathe his sword undeeded. And by the end of the play, after all this repetition of and playing on done, that neologism, so the first recorded usage of the word, undeeded, has acquired a kind of amazing force. It works a bit like a snowball, gathering different connotations and associations throughout the play. We mentioned the importance of prophecy and the idea that they will meet Macbeth ere the set of sun is the clearest prophetic line. So it suggests that the third witch knows when the battle will end, and presumably that Macbeth will win. She's also the first witch to mention Macbeth by name, and later when they meet him to announce his entrance. She also hails him as king and prophesies that Banquo will get kings. So the third witch's function seems to be most strongly related to prophecy. If you were to make a case then that the three weird sisters are in some way related to the fates of Greek mythology, the third witch is the one that seems to be most clearly related to them. Their location on Heath is symbolically significant too. One of the tensions in the play is actually reflected in the settings. So we've got the Heath, which symbolises the forces of chaos or disorder, the thunder, the lightning, the darkness, the wilderness, in contrast to the palaces, the castles, the world of formality and hierarchy. Act 3, Scene 4, the banquet scene, is probably the clearest example of this tension, because we've got that setting of hospitality and formality, and intruding into it is Banquo's ghost. So Macbeth's moment of greatest order, the king hosting everybody important in Scotland, is disrupted by Banquo's ghost, which reminds us of his connection to the witches, because Banquo has been killed as a result of the prophecy the witches made about him. So all 4 witch scenes are quite hard to locate precisely. We're not sure exactly where the Heath is. Even Act 4, Scene 1, the cauldron scene, which we know must be in Scotland somewhere, is called the Pit of Acheron, which is the name for the river in Hades, where Odysseus evokes the dead. And by describing them as posters of the sea and land, it suggests that they're so fast moving, they've got no fixed abode. So it heightens the sense of mystery surrounding the witches. It's as if, just like they are women but have beards, contradicting themselves, which one are they, women or men? Neither. Somehow both. It's as if posters of the sea and land, they're everywhere but nowhere in particular. So when Macbeth goes to visit them, symbolically I think it's an echo of the idea of the descent into the underworld from classical myth and epic. Another important point about the way this scene sets up a structural device for the whole play is that oddly at the end the witches have to answer the calls of their familiars. So the first witch says, "I come, Grey Malkin." The second witch, Paddock, calls. So their little pets or familiars, the cat and the toad, have basically said, "Right, that's enough now, witches. Stop talking. Off we go." Strange. Another word in the play that's important. The subordinate then, the servants, the cat and the toad, less important than the witches, are now the ones giving the orders. And if we think about this inversion of hierarchy or confusion of hierarchy or subversion, then we can find other examples later on. Just a couple. On the night of the murder, thinking about how unnatural the atmosphere seems, we get the story of how previously a falcon was hawked at and killed by a mousing owl. And Macbeth later on is described as feeling Duncan's title hang loose about him like a giant's robe upon a dwarfish thief. So the falcon and owl image and the giant's robe and the dwarfish thief both echo that point in the very first scene about a more powerful being serving or being subverted by a weaker one. The idea of the great chain of being and everything having its place in the cosmos as an ordered hierarchy was very important in Shakespeare's time, and it seems that right from the start it's being disrupted. And that's the point to remember about tragedy generally as well. Order tending towards disorder. Perhaps their most famous line, "Fair is foul and foul is fair," is significant too. Worth noting that it reads the same forwards and backwards. Something oddly disturbing about that. The trochaic meter as well just helps to separate it off from everyday speech. Iambic pentameter is what most of Shakespeare's characters speak, but supernatural characters like the fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream often speak in trochaic tetrameter. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Thinking about the symmetry of the line, it's perhaps reflected in the fact that Macbeth's severed head comes the same number of lines in from the end of the play as MacDonald's severed head does from the start. Macbeth at the end has now become the tyrant, become the traitor to Scotland that is deposed. So he's become the very thing that at the beginning he was fighting against. And unsurprisingly, fair and foul occur again in the play. Macbeth's opening words, remember he hasn't heard the witches, he hasn't heard what they said in the first scene. His opening words are, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." And that's a good example of dramatic irony, when we as the audience know what the witches said and know that Macbeth is echoing them, so it forges a link between Macbeth and them. Lady Macbeth, described as a fair and noble hostess. Well, the idea of fair being foul there is very important because we know what she's plotting. She might look fair, but has foul intentions. Banquo suspects when Macbeth becomes king that he played most foully for it. And there's also the idea of all things foul wearing the brows of grace. So you can't trust appearances in the Macbeth world, where there's daggers in men's smiles. And then foulness to do with infection, disorder, strife, unrest is captured in the idea of there being foul whisperings abroad later on. There's an examiner's report complaining that there was insufficient textual echo 1 year in candidates' answers. So it's important that you're aware of how there'll often be a word or two in any given extract that gains significance through its repetition across the whole play. But what are we to make of the witch's relationship to Christianity? Some people say that fair is foul and foul is fair means they explicitly repudiate it, as if they are somehow the opposite of all Christian values. That might be the case, but they also seem somehow to depend on Christianity for their significance. Banquo links them to the devil, instruments of darkness. Macduff links them to fallen angel, being the devil. But the witches themselves mention neither God nor the devil. But on the other hand, when they talk about what they do and where they go, they never go further in the world than Aleppo, which in the 11th century, remember Macbeth is set in 11th century Scotland, is the far eastern edge of Christendom. So they don't seem to go beyond Christendom. And Graymalkin derives from diminutive of Mary. So even the name of one of the familiars has got a Christian connection too. So they stay within the Christian world, even as they seem to be opposed to it. Perhaps this should be unsurprising by now, given how many paradoxes or sometimes perhaps even contradictions the witches are associated with, and how the initial atmosphere surrounding them is one of confusion and mystery.
So when you say the witches don't ever go further than Aleppo, does that mean the idea of witches never go further than Aleppo?
The witches themselves, talking about where they travel to go and cause mayhem, that's the furthest place away that they mention.